Hi, I'm Ty from Nav. Really glad to have you here for this webinar today. I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about. We have one of the founders of Nav, Levi King, and he is, I think it's fair to say, a serial entrepreneur. He's been running one or another businesses for many years, and has experienced a lot of what most small businesses are going through right now. And I think you're going to like the advice he has for not just surviving times like these, but how to thrive exiting a recession like this. Levi, really glad to have you here.
Thank you. No, glad to be a part of it. I used to actually entirely hate that phrase serial entrepreneur because it felt irresponsible to me for a long time. Like, what do you mean? Like, start a business and stick with it. And then eventually I was like, okay, I've started 8 companies. Like, I'm a serial entrepreneur. It's not a negative phrase. It's a positive phrase.
Well, I'm really, you and I have had this kind of conversation already once, and I'm really excited to talk about what we're going to talk about today. But before we start with some advice and suggestions, as you look at the economy from your perspective, what do you see right now? We kind of need to know where we're at before we can go to where we want to go, right?
Yeah, I think we're in an environment that I think only gets more optimistic. Call it 18 to 24 months, then who knows? That's about as far out as I think any of us can see, and kind of the first time something like this has happened in our lifetime. But yeah, I'm optimistic to a fault, but I think there's a case for real optimism, and there's enough data now on GDP of different states and how well economies are doing. Utah off the charts, number one in the nation with the economy that grew like 4.6%, I think, versus California negative growth rate. And I think this whole question of what's the right balance for lockdowns and everything else, I think it's too tough for governors to shut small businesses down again. The governor here in California facing a recall election in large part or solely over his handling of COVID. And, we've had a frontline view at Nav, and me personally, the business owners I know here, that they got clobbered. I mean, lots of them went out of business. If it wasn't for PPP, lots would have went out of business. No question that PPP made the difference between life and death for lots of small businesses. So I think there's cause for optimism. The states that are doing well, they made the right that are starting or trying to figure out how to get on the right track. I don't think they can go backwards on lockdowns and rules that have an adverse impact to small businesses. I think we're only going to move forward at this point.
Do you think that this particular recessionary time is unique, or are there a lot of similarities between other times you've experienced like this?
I think it's certainly unique. So I started my first business in a recession, the dot-com bust, and I had 2 businesses in operation during the financial crisis. And over the years, at NAV, obviously, we help small businesses with financial health, financing business credit cards, managing their data. And I would get asked by investors or industry players for years, well, how is NAV going to perform in a recession? And I drew from my experience at Lendio, I would answer and say, well, we're going to be counter-cyclical. It's unfortunate for our customers, but what's bad for them is sometimes good for us. And at Lendio, I had actually co-founded Lendio in 2006, brokering small business loans, lines of credit. Credit was so loose. Like I marvel thinking back at how easy it was to get small business owners access to lines of credit, like favorable financing until the financial crisis. And then all of a sudden, if you were prime, you're now alt prime or B. Like you go from A to B. If you were B credit, now you're C, now you're D. If you're D, now you fall out of any like you can't get any financing. And at Lendio, we make more depending on how deep subprime you are, right? So we make the least on A because the skinniest margin there for the lender to be able to pay Lendio. Same is true at NAV. So I always thought, well, we'll be counter-cyclical because one, in a recession, is you're dropping in credit tiers and your suppliers and your vendors are tightening or taking away your credit lines. Your financial health matters more than ever. So NAV's core value prop of business credit, cash flow management, personal credit, that goes up in demand. This is what I would always. Unfortunately, our customers are going to qualify for more expensive financing, which means we make more money. So I only ever predict where, like at Lendio, we would benefit from a recession, which I'm not proud of. Like, I don't want what's bad for our customers we get for us, but it just felt inherent to our business model. I never predicted a world ever where business lending would stop. And so that hit me straight out of left field. And I think that is unique. When you ask about previous recessions, that's entirely unique. In the financial crisis and in the dot-com bust, small business lending didn't go away. It just tightened. But no one pulled out of the market. Not even in the financial crisis, contractors could still get loans. They were just a lot more expensive and a lot tougher to get. And so this was the first time in my lifetime, and probably in time, where it was just gone. No, there isn't a loan, even though there's small businesses that were counter-cyclical, right? And that did great right out of the gates in COVID. Even they couldn't get loans. So it makes it entirely unique. And then just to back up a little bit more from that to say, when was the last time the government said you can't do business to a small business owner? Like, that's unprecedented to say you can't be open. Sorry, nope, your restaurant, you can't be open inside or outside. We just didn't, like, that isn't what a recession has ever been before, right? It was like, no, like, let's try to help small businesses survive. Let's not restrict what they can do. So in those aspects, I think this time around is entirely unique.
So if this is so unique, and I mean, all those things you've brought up, we watched over the last year. What advice do you have? What did you learn going through previous recessions that you think would benefit businesses trying to exit this one?
Yeah. So first of all, I'd say in the previous ones, I don't know that the advice is fundamentally different in the sense of what to do to prepare for a recession, which is make sure your data is in order, your cash flow, your credit, so that you can get access to financing if you need it. But more importantly, have reserve, have a contingency plan. Like look at fixed costs versus variable costs and say, well, would my fixed costs sink my business the way that I've got them structured? That's not necessarily advice that I would have given previously to say, think about how you cost fixed versus variable. I always would have said, make sure you have access to capital, except this time around, I'd say, boy, make sure before I'd say make a position to get financing. Now I'd say, boy, make sure this time around you credit, pile up some business credit. You can stack business credit cards in your wallet. That's what Capital One calls it, where they hope to be the card that you pull out, the business credit card, but you can have Chase and Amex and everybody else. But the difference for business owners that had like a $5,000 limit on a business credit card and those that had $150,000 available to them in credit could have been the difference between life and death for a lot of small businesses in this recession. So I think that before I would say, make sure you're in a position that you could get financing if you need it. Now I'd say, boy, right now get to work on stacking business credit cards or lines of credit in your wallet that you don't have to use, you need to use, but if you need to use them, they're there, they're available, and they can keep you afloat. And not just afloat, there's some businesses wishing to grow, but still couldn't get loans. Like, how crazy is that? That I'm in a business that now, just by the nature of my business and geography, business is going great for me during COVID, and I can't get a loan to expand. Like, that's so counterintuitive. You never would have predicted stuff like that would happen. So it's less about making sure you're in a position to get financing in place.
One time, it's been a few months ago, but we were talking about this kind of issue. And you mentioned that during recessionary times, card providers tend to cut off a certain class of customer and keep another class of customer. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? How do you make a decision as to who they keep and who they don't?
So before I answer that, let me back up and start with kind of a true but funny story. So like 5 years ago, I'm sitting with risk officer and president of American Express globally and his cross-functional team across multiple BUs. And I told him the story of me being a customer Express as a small business owner. It starts with me as a manufacturer with no credit, and I had to mail a check to American Express for something like $500 or $1,000 to get a business credit card with a limit of $500 or $1,000. So it's like a fake business credit card. It's 100% collateralized, right? But then that card, over time, not only did the credit limit grow, when I sold one business, they would move it to the next one. New EIN number, but otherwise same account, kept it intact, which is amazing service. The financial crisis hit and my business was not affected. during the financial crisis. And all of a sudden, not just that card, but all my Amex cards, the limits got cut down to $1,000. And so I tell this story. I'm like, so I love American Express. And then and so when I said like, oh yeah, this card was collateralized, and one guy's like, hey, wait, what year was that? I'm like, oh, I think it was 2000. He's like, I brought that card to market. That was my team. We innovated that card. And I get to the not so good part of the story, and I'm like, yeah, and then all my credit limits got cut. I don't know what algorithm I got caught up in. And some other guy's like sheepish. He's like, sorry, that was my team. We hurt our brand. We made a lot of people unhappy. So just with this group that I'm telling my experience with Amex, and one guy's like, yeah, that was us. He's excited to take ownership, and the other guy's like, sorry, he had to apologize. So we now have relationships at the powers to be at American Express. And they came out to us. You were probably part of it, Ty, in all hands, and said that they'd made mistakes like that with their brand the last financial crisis, and that they weren't going to do that again. That they were going to be prepared for it. That was not that long before COVID hit. And so, if we look at all of it now, American Express is the one that the lights on for small businesses better than any other partner that we have. And so I think what we'll see different next time, because everybody stopped lending in April last year. The alternative in private and independent lenders came back a lot more quickly because they could go geography, industry, and that's a different answer in Idaho Falls, Idaho, than it was in San Francisco, California. But they were quickly able to map to those almost just on the news. Like didn't even need to look at anything other than what's going on in the news in these different states. And private lenders moved quick, and FIs were not ready, so they just pulled out of the market. And I think that will, with the exception of American Express, which stayed in the market. So I think that's going to change. I think that FIs will learn we've got to be able to be more dynamic and say, turn off these zip codes, open these ones up even wider in these industries because they're going to benefit from all this stuff. And I think alt lenders have had that capability to a certain extent. And I think one benefit from this will be that FIs will be a lot more dynamic, like American Express lessons the last time and then really delivered this time. But other FIs got smart people at the top there too. And so I think that'll be a positive thing for small businesses that around it won't be one fell swoop and everybody's impacted the same way.
If you have a few credit cards in your wallet, how do you keep them all from getting cut off? If you've been a good customer, is there a strategy to keeping your credit cards active?
Yeah, and it's not entirely dissimilar from your consumer cards. I had 3 consumer cards with Chase Bank, mainly because I had one with Washington Mutual, which failed in the financial crisis, got gobbled up by Chase, and then another one, I forget their name. So I ended up with 3 Chase cards because they acquired 2 other banks in the financial crisis. And I never used 2 of the cards. They actually just closed them a few months ago. And so they left open my United Airlines card. I don't really use any of them though. But that's not great for your credit, right? You want to have 5 to 9, I think is the where you get the max benefit in the FICO scoring model, and they just closed too. And so if you don't have activity on cards, you're always at risk of getting those cut off. Same is true of business credit cards. So it isn't just about stacking them like in your safe at the office. It's like Capital One, like have it in the wallet and use the cards. Like, some card. You can't say this card is 100% better because of this or that, right? It's like, okay, use my Amex for this type of purchase activity. And this is what we do at NAV. Well, I'm giving the advice that we follow at NAV, right? So we put certain types of expenses on Capital One, different ones on American Express, not just one card. We have several cards with American Express. And so you got to be active with those cards, or you eventually get caught up in some algorithm that's like, this is, we're allocating credit to a business that could be allocated to something. So it isn't just about having them in your wallet. It's about registering some level of activity on those cards, whether you're a revolver or transactor or both.
As we look, I look and I see, compared to where we were last year at this time, I see light at the end of the tunnel. What should small business owners be doing right now to better position themselves for when things do get better, so that they have the resources they need to actually exit the recession in a good place?
Yeah, let me first just agree with your comments. And I think unlike the last 2 recessions, I don't think it was as clear when we were about to exit the recession. It was still like, hopefully, we think so. There's just, now we know economies aren't going to shut down again. Different geos in the U.S. We know we're probably not going to have like high coronavirus cases, right? They're going up in some states, but not like to dire, because now we got the vaccinations happening at scale. And so I think that is one good news, is I don't think it's a lot of guesswork. And then you layer on top of that the stimulus that has bipartisan support. Biden's approval ratings are really high. I don't think the Republicans are going to want to or be able to stop the stimulus package. I think they'll shape what does it look like. But you pump another $2 trillion into an economy after the trillions that have already been pumped in, like that pushes you out of a recession. So if you look at all those combined and say vaccinations happening, governors can't afford to shut down states anymore, and small businesses, a bunch of dough getting pumped in the economy all over. So the good news is, I think it's not, are we leaving? We're leaving the recession. Like for small businesses, it's only going to get better. So that's more of like a check the box on confidence. And then the answer though to the question really varies based on what industry you're in. I'd say one of the most important things to do right now is any vendor or supplier that you had that you kind of got clobbered by, you're a contractor in Gray Bar, shut down your wholesale account, and you had to scramble for cash to pay for your electrical supplies to put into this job up front. There's countless examples. FedEx pulled credit to this industry because their shipments were down, and FedEx was worried about the survival of the company, so they pulled the credit line, right? Like there's just tons and tons of companies that extend credit to small businesses. So that broad group, but then also your bank. Like if your bank pulled your line of credit or your business loan and it really pissed you off, and I wouldn't necessarily write them off. I'd go to the bank and say, hey, look, I proved you wrong, my credit access back. So I think the most important step is whatever your baseline was and access to credit and capital going into the recession, restore it to at least wherever it was. Because if not, it's hard to confidently say like, I'm back, I'm going to grow the business again, I'm going to get back to where I was, if you don't have resources to tap into on the credit and capital side of your business. And if your bank's not there, someone find a new one, because there's lots of lenders. I mean, they have record balance sheets, right? Like everybody's got a balance sheet. That's not the problem. That has been the problem in the past, and that's not the problem today. They got all the capital in the world, but I'd say restore your credit and capital access is number one.
So we know that about a year ago, lenders stopped lending. They've been coming back over the last few months. So are you optimistic that outside of the PPP and the idle type of disaster loans that have kept a lot of businesses alive over the last 12 months, that there is going to be access to capital for small business owners? Yes,
I say absolutely. And not only yes, I think the PPP actually enhances it, because if I'm a lender and, this month I might have a business but they got a PPP, and now I'm looking at that business next month that's got the same proposal, except they got $60,000 on the balance sheet that they didn't have, 90% of which is going to be forgiven. I want to lend to that business all day long. They just got to big time. And I think that's a lot more likely to happen this time around, because the first time around, it wasn't over. I knew how long this is going to last. The second round of PPP, I think everyone knows this is probably it. This is the last injection that's needed. And there was broad access to PPP. And then if you think of the new requirements of PPP, where you had to actually demonstrate the 25% reduction in revenues year over year. So you, number one, yeah, you got hit. Number two, you survived. You just got a slug of cash from PPP, and we're leaving a recession, right? So you're actually, in theory, you're less risky than when I looked at you at March last year, and you didn't have any cash on your balance sheet, and you hadn't survived a recession, which always makes small business owners more resilient, right? They trim costs, they're more lean, they're more scrappy. So you could argue that now is better. It's better to lend to a small business owner now than it was in March pre-COVID of last year.
So last year, when the PPP first came out, there were a lot of the smaller small businesses that couldn't get financing. And part of the reason, at least what I saw, was they weren't prepared to get the financing. They didn't have things in order so that they could apply and easily get it. now, what advice would you give so that these businesses that are they're doing hopefully better than they were a year ago? What can they do now to prepare? What are 2 or 3 things that they should be focusing on so that they'll have easier access to capital over the coming months?
So I think the first is financial hygiene, and that's both your credit, your business credit, personal credit, and also your finances. When I started my first business, that was electric sign servicing, installation, but before I got into manufacturing, that first year, I can still remember me and my wife all over our living room floor with receipts, putting them in different piles. It was literally a shoebox, not a shoebox, but a box we pulled these out of. It was such a mess. It was such misery. Went to the accountant with everything grouped together, and he said, "Okay, you need to buy QuickBooks. I'm going to refer you a list of bookkeepers, you buy QuickBooks, and I'm going to refer you a list of bookkeepers. And if you don't sign up with one of them, I'm not doing your taxes again." Which is such a powerful thing. Into the QuickBooks gets prescribed by accountants, right? Talk about a moat around their business. And so I did. I hired Loretta. I logged into QuickBooks that I remember one time before I hired Loretta, and I was like, nope, not going to figure this out. Years later, we moved to QBO, and I asked Carly, who she works at NAV now. I was like, I want to check out the online version. I logged in one time. I'm not going to do this. But I always hired people that did. And so if a lender's like, hey, share with me your financials, you're like, I need 3-4 weeks to put those together. That right there just shows you don't have your ducks in a row. And so unfortunately, that's still the majority of small business owners. The big joke is their QuickBooks file is right once a year, right after taxes, and then it's wrong the very next week because they got it together to file the tax returns. So it's with technology and the tools that are available today, there's excuse that we've had in previous generations of small business owners to not really just be on top of your financials and your credit. It's easy now. It makes it easy for your business credit, personal credit, whether it's QuickBooks or something else. It's just easy. Payroll through Gusto or somebody like that. Become electronic. Become a business that can quickly document your revenues and your costs, and you're going to be in a lot better spot now and getting access to capital. But that was the problem with PPP. Well, what was your payroll? I don't know. Where do I find that? And shoot, I had to lay off the person that knew, and I don't even know where to find this stuff. Those people missed out, right? And so, but there's other ones just on the ball, got their ducks in a row, could submit the documentation quickly. And, it could have been death could have been you were or weren't ready to get your stuff submitted quickly enough for PPP. How sad is that? That if you just would have had your documentation in order. So I hope that's a big lesson small business owners take out of this is run your business like a real business. It's not a hobby. Yes, you have a craft. Yes, you have a trade for so many of them. You were an electrician. Now you're an electric contractor. You don't realize the business. You're not a journeyman. You're a journeyman contractor working within a business that you own. And I think that level of maturity has just really got to sink in for small business owners in every industry vertical.
I know that when I was running my business, I didn't take the entrepreneurial plunge because I was excited about being in the books every day. But I learned that I had to do that. It sounds to me like what you are suggesting is if that's not your thing, which it wasn't for you, it certainly wasn't for me, that it's worth every penny to surround yourself with people who it is their thing.
Yep, absolutely. Like your income in a business is not sum zero. It is on a paycheck. If you work, unless you're a commission sales or something, it's usually sum zero. But it's not sum zero. Your revenues can go up or down depending on the business. But unfortunately, a lot of business owners think of it as sum zero, especially when they get to the expense side of the business. So you go, okay, well, I'm going to buy QuickBooks at QBO, and that's going to cost me $20 a month, and I got to hire a part-time bookkeeper, and that's going to cost me $800 a month, making up the numbers, right? It could be you need a full-time one. And they're like, well, gosh, I'm profiting X. That's just going to, they think it's sum zero. They don't realize it's an investment in my business. And guess what? It isn't just about being able to get loans. That bookkeeper, if they're worth their salt, is going to say, hey, I noticed we're paying for 2 phone lines, and it seems like we only use 1. And hey, I checked with our ISP and they have a promotion where we can cut our bill in half, or it looks like we're carrying way too much inventory. And so they think sum zero, which is like, oh, that's $800 out of my pocket. And I go, well, how much money is that bookkeeper and having clean financials going to put back into my pocket? And that's the other side of the equation, which is expansive, right? It's accretive to the business. And so that's the mindset shift that has to happen. Is some expenses you make in business, you're looking through the sum zero mindset. That the nature of a business inherently is not sum zero.
You know, I wish I could remember the number. I read a couple of weeks ago that there were, hundreds of thousands of businesses start in 2020, despite the recession, despite the pandemic and everything. There were lots and lots and lots of businesses start. Do you have any particular advice that would benefit these younger businesses in the economy right now?
Yeah, and that's true of every recession, which is, I would say on its surface, it is not intuitive. It's not intuitive to me. But then if you think about people being laid off and stimulus checks, and just like if there's ever like something that happens, make you rethink your life and where you want to be and where you want to spend your time, like a recession or a disruption of the economy, it is an intuitive time to think about it. But it's still counterintuitive to me overall. But that's how it always works in a recession. Is you see more EIN filings and business starts. And I think it's different for the ones that failed and are starting a new business. Is going to be different advice than the ones that are just starting off. Like here locally, a handful of restaurants went out of business, and one, my wife and I ate there regularly, Vault 164, and within like, I don't know, a couple weeks of the for lease sign coming up, it's gone, and now it's Dahlia Fine Mexican, and I was like, wow. That is so gutsy, because this is like a nice Mexican restaurant. Like they had to spend, I don't know, $500,000, $1 million on the build out and retooling everything. I was like, wow, that's gutsy. This person must have deep pockets. A few months later, there were more lockdowns. And my wife's like, oh, read this article. And the owner of Dahlia that's like, we're about to go. I didn't think there'd be more lockdowns. This was the exact opposite of what I thought was some person with deep pockets. It wasn't. And I think one that captures like what is not uniquely American, but American in some other countries where entrepreneurialism is big, right? But on the other hand, this wasn't the guy's first rodeo. I met the owner. He's not in his 20s or 30s and still miscalculated and saying like, oh, the worst is probably behind us. And now it's almost going to sink the ship. So I'd say maybe advice, don't get out over your skis. Like, I think we're coming out of the recession. I think things are going to get better for small business. I think it's mostly positive news, but there's no such thing as starting a small business without bumps. There's always bumps. There's always, even in a roaring economy, it's not easy. And there's all kinds of bumps. So whatever you think you're going to make in revenues, like maybe cut it in half, which sounds crazy, but like say like, okay, this is where I think we're going to be relying on this as far as reserves that I have in the bank and how much money I outlay up front on, instead of buying this equipment outright, just lease it, right? There's a lot of decisions you can make starting off early to preserves that if you have the cash, like, oh, well, I don't want a lease payment. You know what? Take the lease payment and leave that 30 grand in the bank. So be cautious, which is always good advice, but in particular right now, unknowns.
You and I have talked about this issue before. It's not an issue, but we've talked about equipment financing and equipment leasing before. And is there, like in the past, you've said that equipment financing makes sense because you can finance stuff that frees up cash flow for other things. Right now, are there particular types of financing that make more sense than others?
It's always tough to answer broadly just because by industry it varies big time. But I would say inventory financing, invoice financing, AR financing, if you've already got AR, equipment financing, lenders are still going to be a bit inclined towards collateralization of credit, whereas like the more expensive stuff like an MCA, maybe, or some lines of credit, maybe there's not collateralization, and so it's going to be a lot more expensive. So certainly anywhere there's securitization at any level of the debt, you're going to get a better deal. But I always think through the terms of cash flow. like if you get yourself in a position where you have to get an MCA and there's a daily amount taken out of your checking account, that's cash flow. Whereas if you finance your instead of paying cash for it, that helps with cash flow. So I guess that's the lens I would encourage people to look through is take the financing that improves your reserves and your cash flow versus cuts into it. It makes it even harder to survive.
Do you think it makes sense to borrow now, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, I say yes for the reasons that we kind of kicked off the webinar with, which is I think it's safe to say we're moving out of the worst of COVID. And there's a lot of stimulus dollars coming into the economy that's going to buoy things for, like I said, the next 12 for sure, but 18, 24 months. I think the important thing is, recessions are inevitable. So there will be another one. We're going to come out of this and then it's going to be bad again in the future. And so that's back to be careful about how you structure debt and your fixed costs and things like that, because it won't be positive, but I think it's going to be positive for a while, which speaks to great opportunity. But a lot of people went out of business because they weren't prepared. That's good for the people in business. They have more opportunity. So if you're starting out now, just make sure you stay in that category of someone who's prepared to not only thrive now as a new business, but survive the next downturn.
So one last question, and then we'll kind of wrap up. What we're optimistic about the future, and you've thrown out 18, 24 months, a couple things like that make it sound like you're really optimistic. If you were to look in your crystal ball and kind of divine what you think is going to happen and things that we should be watching for as small business owners, what do you think we should be looking for? And what do you think is going to transpire over the next 18, 24 months?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. My crystal ball is the Wall Street Journal. I read lots of pubs, but that's my favorite one. But I think just the pure economics of pumping trillions of dollars into an economy buoy the economy, right? Like that's just they're big enough numbers that you say like this props up an economy. It trickles down all over somehow, right? Okay, let's say it's infrastructure and a bunch of money is pumped into construction companies. Well, they employ tons of and those contractors employ people that now have a better paycheck to go spend at a restaurant or retail store, right? Like it's all connected. We're talking about numbers that are so big that, that's why I say like the 12 months for sure if this passes, but probably more like 18 months. I do get nervous, right? Like during the .com bust, it was the stock market that was overvalued. Housing market wasn't. These other equities weren't. And then the financial crisis, it was the housing market that was in a bubble, but not the stock market. And now we go, okay, stock market's all-time high. Crypto wasn't a thing back then, is a thing now. It's at all-time high. The housing market high. Even during the financial crisis, right before the bubble popped, there was plenty of states that were still buyers markets. It wasn't a national sellers market before the bubble that popped before the financial crisis. Like right now, we have a national, I don't know if it's a bubble, but real estate is going up everywhere in the US. That wasn't even true at the last time. So that part, and then if you look at the private equities world that we live in now, where we have private investors, that's all off the charts. The private equity world, hedge funds moving into private investments, the venture world off the charts. That part makes me nervous because I'm like, wow, everything's at all-time highs. That's not how it's been before other recessions. So who knows? Maybe the next recession will be a big whammy because you got all the bubbles pop at once or around each other. But so that just goes back to my crystal ball. I think we're great for a while. I get nervous that all these are at all-time highs all at the same time. Makes me nervous, and it's a little bit unprecedented, at least in recent history. But none of that's meant to be discouraging. It's like start a business, grow the business in a smart, sustainable way. If you have to miss an opportunity here or there, because that opportunity will put the rest of it at risk, that's too big of a bet, in my opinion, if you're building a lifestyle business. So to be careful with your bets. Like an incremental backhoe is different than I need, 7,000 square feet and I'm tired of paying rent. So I'm building for the future and I'm buying a building that's got 30,000 square feet. Like that's the type of bet that can sink you, right? The incremental backhoe, it's not going to. So, be smart about the expansion, and a recession's coming. like we should have got hit, but like the recession in the traditional sense didn't even happen during COVID. Insane, right? Like stock market was disconnected from reality of normal people's lives during the COVID period. So who knows? I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we're good for a while. How about that?
That sounds good. That sounds good. Thanks for talking with us. I hope all you folks that have been listening to us have gained value from participating with us. We are sure glad you're here. Thank you very much. And thanks, Levi, for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Excellent. Thank you, Ty. Talk soon.